Legislators are home, but pensions are still up in the air. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the program where we talk about state government, sometimes the federal government, and how it just might affect your life. I'm Bernie Schoenburg from the State Journal-Register. The legislators have gone home for the summer, but they will be back, or at least we think they will. And here to talk about it, a couple of guys who went through the painful process of covering the last weeks of the scheduled session, as usual. Chris Wetterich is back. He is a colleague of mine from the State Journal-Register and Associated Papers. Welcome back, Chris.
Thanks for having me, Bernie.
And Mike Riopell, who is the State House reporter for the Daily Herald, based in Arlington Heights, covering a wide swath of the Chicago suburbs. Are you guys number 3 in the Chicago area?
That's right.
There you go. So you got to read that. Anyway.
Yeah, very important. Yeah.
Pensions. You know, I know I made a prediction talking to a group a few weeks before the session ended that yes, they would go into overtime. Well, they didn't go into overtime, but really they did. They finished by the end of May, except for about an hour and a half afterwards that the Senate went on until the morning. But pensions are undone, and pensions were one of the big things in addition to Medicaid cuts and raising the cigarette tax for $1 that is out there. What's going on? We've had a meeting this week with the governor and the leaders. What will happen, and what should state employees and other government employees across Illinois be looking for?
Well, we're in a holding pattern. They really didn't, the Senate passed. It's important to mention, I think the Senate president would have us mention that the Senate did pass a pension reform bill. It only affected the state employees and the legislators themselves. It went over to the House where nothing happened because the Speaker and the minority leader were kind of engaged in a battle over the issue, and we weren't really going to make any progress in the House on that. So
they
give John Cullerton his due, Bernie.
They say they voted for something.
Yes.
On the other hand, if people look at the legislature as a whole, because it didn't pass both houses, it's not to the governor. It's not yet done.
Absolutely. I mean, they're going to meet again later this month. They're getting some more research, some more numbers to see how much the various plans would cost. I mean, I think the big sticking issue for the Republicans is they don't want to see the costs of this pension restructuring passed down to the school districts. In other words, the Senate president, the governor, and the House Speaker, they all three want school districts to eventually pay the pension costs of their employees. Right now, the state pays for them. The three Democrats don't think it's fair.
And this is called what, the cost shift?
The cost shift is kind of the State House nomenclature
because right now, and what they do say is it's terribly unfair that local school districts set the salaries and give raises, and pension is based on a formula based on what they make, and especially what they make in the last time, and then the state pays outside the city of Chicago, which has its own pension.
All three Democrats, notably, are from Chicago, so the state doesn't pick up much of the city's share at all. So that's one argument. I think the school districts would respond to that by saying, well, you guys are the ones who set the benefits. We don't get to set the benefits for teachers. You guys are the ones that set them. You can sweeten them later on after you've passed the cost on to us. So there's, it takes two to tango there.
Yeah, Mike, perhaps from the perspective of suburban districts, which I know there's a wide range of types of suburbs, but some of the more prosperous or rich school districts are in that territory. What do they think of this cost shift, or what do you think might happen?
Well, they're the same as the downstate districts. Their argument often is that we pay the highest salaries in the state, and as a result, this cost shift will cost us the most. That's what suburban districts say. And the Democratic response to that, at least the Chicago Democratic response to that, is that's exactly right. You pay the biggest salaries. As a result, you cost the state the most for pensions, so you absolutely should be paying that share of it. The question now, as Chris kind of mentioned, they're talking about different ways, Democrats are, about maybe doing this cost shift, phasing it in over one period of time, over a longer period of time, maybe using another creative policy means to shift the costs otherwise onto the districts. Can they find a way to achieve that goal that they want, to shift those costs in a way that Republicans and downstate and suburban Democrats, whose districts would also be affected, would go for? And if not, then we might not see legislators again down here this summer. It might wait until after the election.
Another thing to consider with the wealthy districts, another argument they'll make is, we don't get very much money from the state in the general state aid formula that they...
Because their property taxes pay so much of it.
Right, because they're wealthy and the formula doesn't benefit them very well. So they're saying, you know, you're like eliminating the last part of state funding for our districts. And, you know, that's another counter argument.
Well, I know that the day after the session ended, Governor Pat Quinn had a news conference at the State House and talked about how the clock is ticking and we need to act fast to reform the pensions, to get a deal with the leaders, to bring back the legislature to act. And part of that is because rating agencies may downgrade the bond rating of the state, which will ultimately cost millions of dollars more as money gets borrowed. And I know that President Cullerton then said, well, let's just, we can maybe do this piecemeal and change the pension system or future benefits for state employees and legislators, and then leave it to universities and schools, which are the other two main pension systems that the state runs and funds, for another time. But then Governor Quinn said, no, we have to do it all at once. Let's do a big package. So does that make it more difficult to do? And is this...
I mean, the governor's been flip-flopping all over the place on this. I mean, he was the one...
How do you really feel?
Well, no, he just has. I mean, the last day of session, he scuttled a bill by the speaker. You know, this was a very dramatic moment on the House floor during the last days of session, where the speaker had a bill that would have a cost shift, and it would deal with it would deal with 4 of the 5 systems.
Not the judges.
Not the judges.
Who will have to rule ultimately on because everybody's a little scared that the judges can't rule on it if they're in it.
Right.
Which keeps their pension at the same, and some people don't like that.
Right. I mean, they don't like it because it looks like you know, state employees have straight out called it a bribe to be on the phone. They're very angry about that part of it. But we can get back to that later. To your question, though, I mean, you know, what was your question?
Governor Quinn wants to do it all at once and not piecemeal like President Cullerton.
Right. But the last day of session, the governor said, you know, he backed off on that. He instead sided with House Minority Leader Tom Cross instead of the speaker, and he said,
no cost shift this year.
Right. We won't do the cost shift in this bill, and we'll do something else for now. And of course that failed because the speaker didn't support it.
Yeah.
The speaker said, fine, here you go, Cross, here's the bill. And then
meaning the House Republican leader Tom Cross.
And then he said, I'm going to vote no. And guess what? His members
and everybody
voted,
followed.
Right. His members, you know, by the end of the day, it was clear they didn't have enough votes.
I think Quinn's fear might be that a lot of things that get done in Springfield require like some kind of point of pressure, some kind of deadline, and if you in the legislators and can claim some kind of victory on pension reform, then the pressure could be off election-wise to do anything else. Meanwhile, the teachers and the university workers and the community college people, plus the cost shift, won't be dealt with, which is about 50%, maybe more of the overall scheme of things. So you would leave that undone, and then you have to look for the next point of pressure. You have to go through all this all over again. And that's probably why he wants at least the cost shift bundled. In the scenario Chris was talking about, at least, you know, he wanted the cost shift off, so you would still do the teachers and the university people.
All the systems except the judges.
You just wouldn't do the cost shift. Then Cullerton doesn't want even the teachers and the university people, which I think you could argue doing this twice would be harder than doing it once.
And of course, anytime there's what might be considered a targeted group, they have more time to call their legislators, amass support for their side, and fight change that will be costly to them over time.
They've done it twice before. They've done it 3 times. When they created the 2-tiered system for future employees, you know, they did the 5 state-funded systems, and then they addressed cops and firefighters, your local municipal workers, the next year. That's what they'll end up having to do with this too, because the cities like Mayor Emanuel in Chicago are demanding that they get some pension relief as well. So they're going to be taking a lot of bad votes on this no matter how they do it.
It's not easy with no money. It used to be so much easier, it appears, to be a legislator when they were getting, you know, an extra $500 million or $1 billion a year in just new revenue, and now it's kind of the opposite of that. Even if they get more, the expenses are so high. As the legislature came to a close, in fact, just before an hour and a half before midnight on May 31st, there was a bill being debated in the Senate that would have raised license plate fees in Illinois, the basic fee from $99 to $101, just a $2 increase. That was one of 19 fee increases, all of which would have gathered, I think it's about $40 million for Department of Natural Resources to state parks, really, I think the argument can be made, certainly it is by the administration and Mark Miller, who runs the department, that Governor Blagojevich did not seem very interested in state parks, and he would seemingly punish members of the legislature by either closing their parks or threatening to. And they lost a lot of staff at these parks. Some of them only have 1 or 2 people working there now, so you don't have tours like you used to, and some of the maintenance is going down. So they were really arguing we need an influx of money from somewhere, because the general cut in the state government is just going to hurt these parks more. So, but it didn't pass because I know particularly members. It was Toy Hutchison, state senator, South Suburbs.
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah.
Who was arguing for this rather passionately on the floor of the Senate, but particularly Republicans are saying, our people are already taxed enough, and we don't want a new fee here.
Well, it did get a majority in the Senate. The problem was it was
after midnight.
12:30.
Oh, was it after midnight? Okay, so it got, was it 33 votes?
got 33
I think
votes,
it was, and it would have needed only 30 to pass before midnight.
At
But because it was
11:59.
after midnight, to take immediate effect, it would take 36,
Yeah.
and that's when they couldn't. So what's going to happen? This is just one department, but it does affect the entire state, and looks like more cuts are coming.
Yeah, I mean, they could certainly try again. This summer, if they come back to do pensions, they could do a number of different things, including giving that a shot. If they put off the effective date of this thing, then it would only need 30 again, and maybe they could move it. This proposal with the license plates replaced a different plan to try and save the state parks that would require you to buy some kind of parking sticker, basically charge you an entrance fee to get in. At some point, this new plan with the different fees supplanted that plan, and looked to be on its way on May 31st, and then it was half an hour too late or something like that.
Yeah, it was very strange. They had a timing problem in the Senate on Thursday night, well, Friday morning.
It's those deadlines. Do we know about those in our business? Anyway, difficult times, and wait and see if the administration makes more cuts or takes some action that could ease this pain that we're seeing everywhere. Other pain that was talked about really for months was facility closures, and as the state budget was passed, I think there was some money to keep operating some of the facilities like Jacksonville Developmental Center, and then some adult transitional centers in cities including Aurora and I believe Decatur, but I think there are still plans that the administration has to certainly close Jacksonville, I know, and Mike, you were talking about the transitional centers in particular. What's going on? Because that covers your territory.
These centers are places where people go who are finishing their prison terms to hold a job and kind of reintegrate into
is a halfway house the right word?
Kind of, yeah. Okay. Hold a job. Quinn would replace those centers with basically ankle bracelets, electronic monitoring. The legislators whose districts include these closing facilities didn't want them closed. The budget that the legislators passed included money for them to keep it open. Quinn does not have to spend that money if he doesn't want to, and so far he says that he will proceed as he has planned and go ahead and close those.
Yeah. You can still close JDC even though there's money for it. It's completely up to the governor. So.
Yeah, and we have no strong indication of where that. I mean, he did say, I think, that he still believes in a transition for developmentally disabled people in the state out of institutions and into community-based settings, which of course some of the parents of the people who have been living in facilities like Jacksonville for years are very upset about this. And
I think he's going to close them. That's the bottom line. And if not, sooner than later.
And we will go on from there. The legislators from there, who actually are all, or mostly, the Republicans represent the territory, but...
Well, JDC, he did a fairly good job of evening it out between Democrats and Republicans. He could have been very punitive about it, and I think they probably have in the past.
Well, my point wasn't the punitive nature. It was that even though they're philosophically for cost cutting, these legislators also want these facilities open for, talking about the need that the families have and
Tea Party rhetoric and small government, all that's great until it's your stuff, and that's kind of
not that we want to generalize too much, but
Sam McCann, one of the Tea Party legislators in our legislature,
he was one who spoke against the license plate fee for parks, even though he loves the park in his territory.
That's true, but at the same time he's fought against JDC's closure, and the advocates on the other side would make the argument that the governor's right, that all across the country these types of facilities are being closed because they're inefficient and they don't do as good a job as a community-based setting. The families don't believe that, but that's kind of what the research shows nationwide. So, there's a case to be made for the closures, and there's a case to be made against it. But I think the governor's going to prevail on that.
As we are not sure when the legislature is coming back, there is an issue with one relatively new House member named Derek Smith from Chicago, who won his primary, although he used to be in Secretary of State Jesse White's organization, and then after he was put into a House seat, I guess the feds or some law enforcement caught him on tape taking what he believed to be a bribe, or that's what he's been charged with, just like $7,000 in cash if he would help a daycare center, which didn't even really exist, but it was a setup, and he kind of fell into a trap, and they're calling that entrapment, and he's staying in the House. Now the Democrats have found an independent candidate to run, and Jesse White is very hopeful that
they've created a new party because they
right, and they're trying to get somebody besides him elected. But also the legislature is moving forward on its own towards some kind of censure or impeachment. Where do we think this is going? Because there was just a report that came out on that this week.
Yeah, this week, the first panel that was weighing the facts of this decided they had enough to to recommend some kind of punishment of Derek Smith. Now there will be a jury of House members created. There will also be 2 House members to try the case, I guess you would say. What they eventually decide, who knows? I mean, they certainly could be moving toward kicking him out of the House. That could happen in the next couple months, even as the legislature as a whole isn't meeting. It'll end up, what does this jury decide? It seems like they might, politically safe thing to do might be to vote to kick him out, but who knows what they'll end up deciding.
And those are never easy votes. I mean, this one might be easier than some, but I've seen a couple people expelled over a long number of years, including someone named Peg Breslin once, who, because she didn't live in her district and got elected, they expelled her one day, and then because she had now lived in her new district for 6 months, which was her actual home when she wasn't away at school, she was named to replace herself the next day. So it was like a 3-hour debate on the floor, and then she was replaced. But I don't think that would happen with Representative Smith.
I agree, yeah.
I think that's an easy vote for them to expel him. I mean, he was accused of taking a $7,000 bribe. I mean, the legislature has a bad enough reputation as it is.
When will this ever end in Illinois? That's the question.
and the legislature doesn't have all the burdens that like an actual legal conviction would need. They just have to want to do it. I mean, they don't have to.
They don't have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt.
Right? Yeah.
Speaking of ethical things, the governor talked a lot of ethics when he was asked right after the session, what are you going to do with the gambling bill that perhaps surprisingly the legislature did send him at the end of session, which would create, I think, 5 new casinos and slots at some racetracks, although not at the State Fair and not at the airports in Chicago. Sounds like he doesn't want to go for that. Is that what everybody's thought?
He wants a campaign contribution ban for this class of political actors, people who are involved in the gambling industry. He doesn't want them to be able to contribute campaigns. Those of us who are cynical think it might have something to do with the fact that Dick Duchossois, the owner of Arlington Park Racetrack, has been a heavy supporter of Republican interests in general. The governor himself, has, I believe, a friendship with the guy who owns Rivers Casino. I think you.
Oh, is that Neil Bloom, I think?
Yeah.
Developer in Chicago.
Yeah.
That's in your territory, too.
Right.
Out by O'Hare. That's right in the middle of traffic. But that has taken away business from other boats, like in Elgin and Aurora.
It has by far become the state's biggest casino at the expense of Elgin and the 2 Joliet boats in Aurora. And it's still not pulling the kind of money that Elgin, the formerly biggest casino, was in its heyday.
Right.
2007 or but it has by far, by maybe double, become the state's biggest casino.
The legislators from places like Rockford and Danville that would get new casinos under this plan, they say, well, we're losing the business to other states anyway, so why not keep it in Illinois and keep them from going over the borders? Whereas the governor argues, like in the case of the Rivers Casino in Des Plaines, we're reaching a saturation point. You can't keep building
Wow.
new gambling casinos because we're just taking money from each other and it's not benefiting the state. And then, of course, there used to be an argument, gambling is bad, we shouldn't be doing it to raise money to fund government. That's kind of out the window.
The governor doesn't have a problem with Rockford and Danville and all those places. He has a problem with Arlington Park and the other racetracks having basically casino gaming in their racetracks because racinos because they're close to places like Rivers and Elgin and all of those. That's where he's really worried. He says he's really worried about the cannibalization is from those racetracks.
And he's really tried to make this about ethics, at least lately. Yeah. And so now Senator Link has a bill that Chris mentioned to get rid of those campaign contributions.
Right.
So perhaps if that bill makes it to the governor, when lawmakers come back, perhaps the governor would soften his position on that kind of thing, or if he doesn't, they'll have to try and override his veto.
Well, and Terry Link, the state senator from Waukegan, would Waukegan get a vote here too, or somewhere near there?
Right outside.
Lake County.
Yeah.
And he's been pushing this for a couple of years now.
Mid-90s.
And he made a rather impassioned plea as well. Look, Governor, read my trailer bill. We'll pass it this fall. I'm not sure if the governor will go for that, though, necessarily, because it makes it also look like the bill is incomplete the way it is, because if the legislature somehow didn't pass the next piece of legislation to fix it up, then you're stuck with something the governor doesn't like.
One thing that's really interesting about this, it used to be that expanding gambling was considered a bad vote, and you didn't want to do it unless the governor was on board. Now both chambers have voted twice to expand gambling, and if he vetoes this bill and they go back and try to negotiate with him, they'd have to vote a third time. I mean, it's just amazing to me that the state is in such poor financial shape and in desperate need of money that people are taking these votes on gambling repeatedly and not really worrying about it.
Yeah, and it used to be a more rare thing that states had gambling, and now it's almost universal. So.
One odd thing about a remap year like this year is that it's still before the November election. There's already more than a dozen lame ducks in the General Assembly who are kind of have a little more freedom to not have to worry about there will be even more after the November election, but there's at least a dozen, maybe 15 to 20 now who, because of primaries, because of retirements or decisions to run for other things, don't have to worry about that.
Some of those people might end up lobbying.
Possibly.
I mean, it is interesting that one of the people who's been pushing the gambling bill is Bill Black, who's a former legislator, longtime legislator
from Danville,
from Danville, and he's been pushing it hard. And I think he's on the Danville City Council now.
Bob Malaro lobbying for the horse racing industry, former Chicago lawmaker. Yeah.
Before we run out of time, I did want to mention that, and we're talking about ethical things. Bill Cellini of Springfield, long time known as a chief fundraiser for Republicans and kind of a behind-the-scenes power guy. Also worked with people associated with the Blagojevich administration, which he probably wishes he didn't do because he was then convicted of a couple of federal corruption charges of working in a scheme that was trying to get Hollywood producer Thomas Rosenberg to pony up a campaign contribution for Blagojevich. He maintained he didn't do it, but he was convicted of two things. Well, he's awaiting sentencing, and he just unfortunately had a heart attack, and as he was going through a procedure just this last week at Memorial Medical Center in Springfield, he is home resting. We don't yet know when he will be sentenced, but certainly we wish him well, but it puts another wrinkle in a very odd thing. He's 77 years old and had another heart attack, I guess, back about 10 years ago. So
it's got to be extremely stressful to be awaiting sentencing. I mean, that's, for a guy like that, I mean, it's hard for him probably to imagine spending a year or who knows how long it would be in prison.
Yeah. And he, of course, not always known statewide, and maybe not even a household name yet, but he became better known when he, in the Thompson era, and he was a big backer of Jim Thompson, he became the first license holder of a gambling boat in Illinois when they became legal, and that was the Alton Bell, which he then later sold and made a lot of money on that transaction. So on we go. Illinois is not Wisconsin yet. People used to say that because Wisconsin was so ethical and their lobbyist disclosure laws were so tight, but now they have Scott Walker, and they just had a recall election because they've been kind of a Democratic state in presidential elections, but they have a Republican governor. who took on the unions and basically won in taking away many collective bargaining rights, and which he says saved the state money. They had a recall election just this past week, and he survived easily over the mayor of Milwaukee in a rematch because they had run against each other in 2010. Any crossover that this has to Illinois? I know that there are some who wish we had a Scott Walker here. Governor Quinn, of course, beat Bill Brady, who was probably more aligned with Republican philosophy that Scott Walker has. So what do we take from this?
It's interesting because they've had all this labor strife up there and unrest and whatnot, but Governor Quinn took money from AFSCME, probably wouldn't have won re-election without their help, and promptly turned around and throttled them. He canceled their raises. He's pushing for pension reform that they don't like and will probably end up hating.
He's closing facilities.
He's closing facilities, laying off workers.
Probably going to take away retiree health care.
Yes, he hasn't signed the bill.
That's right, if he signs the bill, retirees who had 20 years and were supposed to get free health care for life now will have to pay something as decided by Central Management Services Department.
So he's done a lot of things that labor doesn't like without really any of the blowback nothing compared to what Scott Walker has faced. When Scott Walker was in Springfield to give a speech, there were, and most of these were Illinois union members, but there were well over 1,000 people on the street protesting him. And I was talking to a reporter from Wisconsin who I know, and this follows him everywhere he goes in Wisconsin. There's always a crowd to protest his his administration. So
well, it hasn't gotten that way here, but as you say, it's interesting that everybody's pension is under attack. Just before we finish, I'm going to mention that William Enyart, who's been the Adjutant General of the Illinois National Guard, has resigned. As we sit here, we think he might be the next candidate as a Democrat for Congress in the 12th District in Southern Illinois, where Jerry Costello is retiring. Jason Plummer, who was the Republican nominee for Lieutenant Governor last time, is the Republican candidate. We'll watch that one. Chris Wetterich, Mike Riopell, thanks for being with me. Thank you for being with us. I'm Bernie Schoenburg, and we'll see you next time on Capitol View.